Conversation with the Candidate continues.
Welcome back to Conversation with the Candidate and our candidate, Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld. We have our New Hampshire Town Hall audience with us here. We're going to get to as many questions as we can. We're going to start with Christy St. Laurent.
Hello. Good evening, Governor Weld. In the unusual setting of a primary challenge from within the incumbent's party, how do you anticipate keeping the discussion out of the schoolyard and focused on the issues?
Well, I'm going to try to emphasize what I want to do as President of the United States. And there's a lot on my mind. I mean, I think Washington does a very poor job of cutting spending. As a matter of fact, they don't do any job of cutting spending and cutting taxes, both of which I did as governor in Massachusetts. In fact, right after I got in, I was ranked the most fiscally conservative governor in the United States, and that was as a Republican in Massachusetts succeeding Michael Dukakis. So that took some doing. But I do think that's important, and they're off, including the president, they're off in the wrong direction on this $1 trillion of deficit a year. The president's most recent budget would add, admittedly a 10-year budget, but it would add $7.9 trillion more dollars to the deficit. The millennials, our children and grandchildren, are going to pay that bill. So that would be my first focus as president.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Our next question comes from Sam Kluger.
Governor Weld,
Sam?
my question is, what is your stance on the United States pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and what steps will you take to ensure that my generation and my children's generation can enjoy their lives in an environmentally healthy environment?
Well, I think the president pulling us out of the Paris Climate Accords was a disaster. And I would rejoin on day one. I think we have to adopt 2050 CO2 limitations consonant with what other industrialized nations are doing. I don't think that the industrialized North, to oversimplify, can say to the unindustrialized, lesser developed South, we've already had the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. We're going to sit on what we've got, and now you've got to agree to limit all your CO2. You know, I think maybe there could be compensation for them agreeing to put rainforests in the situation where they are now, and something could be worked out. But we've got to show leadership there, or else these white mountains aren't going to be white anymore because they're not going to have snow on them. And the polar ice cap is going to melt, and all our coastlines, including the seacoast of New Hampshire, is going to be rearranged. And there's going to be a lot of shorefront property that's not shorefront now because it's 10 miles inland.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Our next question comes from Elizabeth Radisich.
Good evening. Thank you. While I share some of the values of the Republican Party, as the mom of 2 African American children and as a woman, I don't feel like the Republican Party has an umbrella of inclusiveness. How would you change your party so, as a moderate woman like me with a multiracial family, could feel like the party actually wants my vote?
Well, it wouldn't take any acting on my part, I'll tell you that. I shouldn't have to say this, but I will say this. I've never groped a woman anywhere, and I never will. Honestly, and if 13 women came forward and all said that I had groped them, I'd be very unlikely to say, well, they're all lying, because it would seem vanishingly unlikely. You know, when I was in office, I was known for inclusiveness, and that includes racial as well as just trying to unleash everybody's energy. But I appointed an African American commission, Asian American, Hispanic American. I met with them all once a month, and they felt included. It relates to another issue I care about, which is immigration. The president's rhetoric seems to be he wants to make everybody feel terrible. Anybody who's you know, not been a citizen here for 25 years. And I think the job of the president is to make everybody feel good about being an American. And I think it's bad for the whole country. And from a prudential point of view, by prudential I mean preserving social cohesion, if people live in the shadows. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I was the first guy out of the block with gay and lesbian civil rights my first year in office. And I was, believe me, by myself for 20, 25 years there, because I think when people live in the shadows, that should not exist in a democracy. You know, that can exist under tyranny because that's part of what the tyrant wants. But I think on both gender and racial grounds, you would find me probably about as friendly a public administrator as you'd ever want to meet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We now have a social media question coming from Daniel Schrock. He asks, Governor Weld, what will change from being governor of the Commonwealth to being President of the United States, and what would you do differently?
Well, I try to do sort of the same type of thing I did as governor. I put in place policies that would unleash everybody's energies, make everybody feel included. My cabinet was eight women and 3 men, and always included minorities. I didn't want anyone to feel that they weren't part of the equation. So that's something I would want to bring to Washington, where, guess what? It doesn't reside right now. You know, it's not only the president. The situation of the D and the R parties, they sometimes seem to me to exist mainly for the purpose of killing the other party. You know, I made a great point of meeting with the Democratic legislature leaders every week, because it's hard to, you know, stab somebody in the back if you know you're going to see them over coffee and cookies sometime in the next 7 days. And that was very successful, and they've kept that tradition to this day. Charlie Baker, who is a 2-time cabinet member for me, who's now the governor of Massachusetts, meets with the Democratic Speaker and the Senate President every single week, and it's good for the people, because you hammer out policies that nobody's screaming and kicking about, because it's been through a process of analysis by both parties across the aisle.
So perhaps re-energizing the social relationships and networks in Washington.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from Rachel Spirer.
Hi. Welcome, Governor Weld.
Thank you.
And your answer ties in with what I'm going to be asking.
Okay.
As president, how would you, as our leader, work to break down the deep divisions that we currently have in our government, and especially on Capitol Hill?
Well, that's right. And my first job in government, I worked for Senator Javits of New York, who was a moderate Republican senator with many, many Democratic friends. And this is in my early 20s. I was writing his speeches about Latin America. But the thing that sticks with me is that was a time when lions still roamed the earth in the Senate. And there were a lot of very well-known senators. And if one of them was going to give a major speech in the Senate galleries would be filled with interns like myself and members of the press and members of the public who wanted to hear the speech in real time to see whether they would be persuaded. And that's part of how policy was hammered out. And those days are gone. If someone's giving a major speech now, it's given at 3 in the morning in a totally dark chamber, and the rules of C-SPAN don't let them stray from the face of the candidate. So no one knows the chamber is dark and no one is there. And the reason is because the speech is not being given to persuade. It's being given for polemical reasons, to stake out a position that that party can then use for fundraising. So, you know, my approach would be kind of the opposite of what they've had in Washington for better than a decade now. I think the trend really started in the 90s, but it's been going on for some time, and it's just no way to run a railroad. Unless your only obsession is with getting reelected. Then it's a great way to run it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
I was president of U.S. term limits when I was governor, national president of U.S. term limits. So you can guess where I am on obsessed with being reelected, as in not.
Well, what would be appropriate term limits for the House, and would you approve them for the Senate as well?
Oh yeah, 2 terms for the Senate and either 3 or 4 terms for the House. So 12 years for the Senate and 6 or 8 for the House.
Would you still have those lions of the Senate if they were limited to 2 terms?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the truth is, if you can't get done what you want done in about 6 months, you haven't been very effective, and that doesn't matter whether you're a senator or a president. You know, I always tell people who are running for office, if you don't have a short priority list, maybe you shouldn't be running for that office. And you know, when I ran for governor of Massachusetts, I wanted to change the fiscal policy so we wouldn't be spending money like a bunch of drunken sailors. I was coming right after 3 terms of Governor Dukakis, who's a good friend, former law partner of mine, but they really had gotten that government huge. It was 88,000 state employees at the height of Governor Dukakis' run for the presidency in 1988, and I cut that down to 62,000 in short order after I got in there, because it really wasn't necessary.
Another reform question coming from social media. Palma Borns asks, what will you do to reform the welfare system?
Well, I did a welfare reform in 1994 in Massachusetts, which became the model for the 1996 federal welfare reform. It was an example of the states being laboratories of democracy. And what I did was put in a work requirement assuming that people didn't have any preschool-aged children so that they were able to take work. And it had been drawn to my attention earlier that people spend a lot of time looking for work and studying for work and thinking about work, but in my view, there's no substitute for work. So if they said, I can't find a job, we said, as part of this bill that I got passed, well, don't worry, we got plenty of jobs for you. There are schools and there are prisons and there's painting that needs to be done, there's cleanup that needs to be done. We'll give you a job. 30 hours a week, we're not going to crush anybody. And if you got little kids you got to take care of, you're exempt. Well, the welfare rolls went like that after that bill was passed, because there were a lot of people who really didn't need to be in that situation. Of course, everyone called me, they said I was grinding the face of the poor. Quite the contrary. I was preserving the system so that it could fulfill the function that it was designed for. That was the model for the 1996 Welfare Act as well.
Our next question comes from Brody DeShays.
Nice to meet you, Governor Weld. My question is about what are you going to do to reduce the federal government's debt, and how will you prevent large deficits?
Well, I do what I did as governor in Massachusetts, and that's to engage in what's called zero-based budgeting. And instead of doing what they do in Washington, which is to start every budget account with last year's number plus 5% or 10%, what you do is analyze what happened last year. And if there are a lot of good outcomes, like a preventive health program that kept a lot of people from getting sicker and saved a lot of taxpayers' health care dollars, you might multiply that appropriation by 5 or 10. But if there was an obscure, sub-bureau of mines or something which had been there for 30 years with a guy, doing crossword puzzles at his desk, and it got $5 million last year, as it always had in the past, you zero that out. And you can save a lot of money that way. And that was why the Wall Street Journal and the Cato Institute said that I was the most fiscally conservative governor in the country in my first term.
Thank you, Brody. Next question comes from Sean Bentley.
Good evening, Governor Weld. What do you think differentiates you the most when compared to President Trump?
Well, I'm kind of a calm individual, slow to anger, and I enjoy life and enjoy making a contribution to the public good. I think the president is kind of all over the place. A lot of it seems to be about the president and not about the people that he was elected to serve. And I know that's a psychological thing and a personal thing, not a policy difference, but I think it's the biggest difference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Next question comes from Aaron Maddow.
Good evening, Governor. The process of bringing new medicines to market goes through a multi-billion-dollar approval process to get the drug to market, which in turn creates high drug prices. What would you do to address this?
Well, high drug prices, a couple things we could do is let people buy pharmaceuticals across state lines and in other countries like Canada. That would be somewhat of a help. I do think that one of the geniuses of the American system is we do recognize that the process of development of pharmaceuticals is expensive, and we allow companies to recoup those costs. But there are variables here, like how long is the period of patent protection before it goes to generic? It's now 17 years. Could there be movement around the edges there? But having been governor of a state that has a huge biotech industry, partly as a result of incentives I put in when I was governor. When I came in, we were losing biotech companies to Illinois, to New Jersey, to Research Triangle and the Carolinas. By the end of my first term, I put in so many incentives for the biotech industry that if you were a biotech company and you did not have an office in Kendall Square, Cambridge, you were at a competitive disadvantage. And that was very good for Massachusetts. So I'm not here to demonize the pharmaceutical industry at all. I do think that particularly for the elderly, the cost of pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs, has gotten totally out of hand. So that would be probably a high-level task force personally supervised by me or my top Health and Human Service Secretary. And I have some sense of the trade-offs that are involved here and the needs of industry, but the even more important needs of individuals not to get priced out of the market where they can get the pharmaceuticals that they need.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron. Our next question comes from Spencer Diaz.
Good evening, Governor Weld. How would you handle the crisis in Venezuela, and how would you apply this to all foreign crises?
Well, I think the crisis in Venezuela has been handled pretty well. I thought it took some nerve to recognize Guaido as the head of the country when Maduro was still there. Maduro seems to be the first foreign dictator that President Trump has met that he doesn't really like. He's a great admirer of Putin and Kim in North Korea, and Viktor Orban, not yet a dictator, but wants to take Hungary out of the Western orbit into the Soviet sphere of influence. Duterte in the Philippines, who personally kills people with guns, personally kills them, suspected of dealing in narcotics. So this is a refreshing change. I was down in Colombia a couple of weeks ago and met one night for dinner with former President Juan Manuel Santos, who got the Peace Prize for getting the Colombian rebels to come to the table. And the next day met for dinner with President Duque, who's the new president of Colombia, 42 years old. And the Colombians, of course, are very interested in what goes on next door in Venezuela. As a matter of fact, it was Colombians taking humanitarian aid across the border that Maduro said, oh no, we're not going to accept this, throw that in the river, reject it, because he didn't want to admit that he needed help for his people. The situation is a little complicated by the presence of Cubans, senior military officers, and they're kind of, my sense is, and my briefings are, that they're kind of telling the Venezuelans how to handle things, and China and Russia both exercise a good bit of influence over Venezuela. So I think you got to deal with China and Russia. I'd go to them first, and then Cuba, to try to get something worked out that would create pressure on Maduro simply to withdraw.
Thank you, Spencer. We have another social media question here, this one coming from Facebook and Erica DeRoches. Will you release your tax returns?
Yes, I plan actually at some point, not too deep into the campaign, to release 5 or 6 years of tax returns, just to put the question squarely to Mr. Trump.
And one more question here. We've seen other Massachusetts politicians run for president on both sides of the aisle, from Dukakis to Kerry to Romney, and it hasn't worked out too well at the national level. Do you know why that is?
Worked out okay for Jack Kennedy.
Oh, it was a long time ago.
Yeah, no, I think those are good candidates. I was with Mitt Romney all the way in both 2008 and 2012, and I thought he was a good, strong candidate. He just ran up against a juggernaut in the Obama administration. He did a little bit better than 2008, but only one state, I think only Virginia. So that was not a great year to run as a Republican. A lot depends on, what year you're running and what party you're in. And in 1994, when I ran for re-election, it was a fabulous year to run as a Republican. I'd been elected with 50.01% of the vote in 1990, and in 1994 we got 71% of the vote. That wasn't because I had improved as governor, it's because it was a great year to run and we had a record to run on.
Okay, Governor Weld, that'll do it for us for television. We do want to encourage our viewing audience to join us online and on our mobile app, where we're going to continue this conversation with voter questions for another 30 minutes. Next week, we're going to have Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper join us for Conversation with the Candidate. But until then, we'll see you. We thank you for watching. We thank Governor Weld. We thank our audience. And please do join us over online and on our mobile app. But until then, have a good night.
Thank you, Adam.